In this unit, we're going to discuss installing Windows Server 2012. So our objectives are to understand how to plan an install for Windows Server 2012 R2, and I'll also talk about the process of installing Windows Server. And then we're going to talk about using ServerCore. So once you install it, you'll have to start working with ServerCore to do the initial configurations. We'll talk about that. Doing it in the GUI is obviously much simpler for those who are not familiar with it. And then we'll talk about some of the new features on demand. So there's a new feature in Windows Server that that lets you control how you add features and how it stores the files for those features, which makes it a little bit more efficient. So we'll talk about some of the advantages of using that and just some of the tips in how to use that feature. So let's go ahead and get started. So as far as planning a server, planning for a server installation, so some networks are going to require more planning than others. Obviously, smaller networks require very few decisions before you can do the installation. But for larger installations, larger networks, you'll need to make sure that whatever you're doing for the installation of that server is going to work with the wider network. So it is a little bit more work when you're doing a server installation on a larger network because you have to know the environment and you have to know exactly how it's going to fit in with that environment and all the different options that are required. So a network environment roles on a server will play on the network are key considerations. So in other words, you want to make sure that you know what roles you're going to need on that server before you run the installation. And what role that server is going to have on the network, right? So that can guide you in what features you're going to need for that server. So installing the first server on a new network, some hardware considerations. You want to think about the CPU architecture, AMD or Intel. That's a decision that you would have made before you start the installation. Also, the what line processor, in other words, 64-bit or 32. It's important to note that Server 2012 only supports 64-bit. There is no 32-bit version of 2012 of the 2012 server operating system. The total number of physical processors. And it's important to note that you could also use multi-core, but physical sometimes is a little bit better than using, if you want 4 processors, 4 physical processors might be better than multi-core. And a lot of times you're combining these, right? So you might have 2 quad-core processors giving you a total of 8 cores to the operating system. So there's a variety of ways to do that. So like I said before, Microsoft no longer makes a 32-bit version of its server operating system. And virtualization extensions, the CPU needs to support virtualization if you're going to use Hyper-V. So you want to make sure that the hardware you're using will support that. So if you're installing Data Center Edition and your intention is to install lots of virtual machines on that, you want to make sure that the CPU supports Hyper-V if that's the role that you're considering. You'll also want to take a look at your disk subsystem. So do research on what kind of drives you're going to use. Make sure you know that beforehand, and make sure you have the drivers readily available if they're not standard. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And some servers, of course, are going to support the hot add and hot replace features, which let you add memory and CPU without shutting the system down, which is good for availability and gives you the flexibility to add additional resources when they're needed. So once you make all those decisions, there's some other things we have to consider. The name of the server has to be unique. Like I said, in a small environment, that's usually pretty easy, but in a large environment, you're going to have to make sure that you comply with some kind of naming convention, or they may even give it to you already if you're planning on adding a server. You'll have to know what network protocols you're going to be using. IPv6 is on by default in 2012. In some networks, you'll have to turn that off. In some networks, you can only use IPv4. Some you're only going to use IPv6, so it depends. If you're using older protocols like IPX, SPX, which were from Novell, you'll need some third-party solution to support those and no longer natively supported in Windows 2012. Although those protocols are not widely used anymore either. I would hazard to guess that many of you won't see those too much anymore. You want to make sure that you have an IP address for the server. The server can use dynamic IP or automatic IP addressing using DHCP. It'll do that by default. But generally, servers should have a static IP. I will tell you that in most networks today, it's unusual that we're setting an IP address on a server. Instead, we use a reservation in DHCP. So it's already configured in DHCP and predestined to get a certain IP address from DHCP. That seems to be the better way to do this rather than using static IPs. But you could set the static IP on the server itself. You're going to make sure that you put it in the right time zone. I think most of us know what time zone we're in, but the thing about servers is in many cases they're going to be used by folks in other time zones, so you want to make sure you get the time zone correct, which is going to be important for authentication, which we talk about later in this course. And of course, decide whether your server is going to be part of a domain or if it's just going to be standalone in a work group. So you'll have to make sure you know how you're going to do that and which roles you're going to be installing when you install the server. So all of this stuff you should determine ahead of time so you're ready to answer these questions when you do the install. When you complete the installation in our lab environment, it is going to tell you what to use for all of these different options. So it'll walk you through and make those decisions for you. So to perform a clean installation, so basically a clean installation is where we're installing the operating system on either a new disk or where we have an old disk but we don't care about what's on it. We're just blowing out whatever's on that disk and doing a new installation. So that is a clean installation. So usually you would use a DVD or an ISO if it's a virtual machine, and you'll boot from the ISO or the DVD or CD in order to start the installation. And after it begins, a message is going to be displayed that it's loading all the files, and that might take a little bit of time. You'll have to pick the language, the time, and the keyboard configuration in order to continue, and it's going to look a little bit like this. So when you see this screen, you're well underway in the installation for your Windows 2012 server. So if you're performing a clean installation, after you click Install Now, it's going to prompt you for the product code. Unless you're installing an evaluation edition, it's usually good to put the product code in if you have it. Otherwise, it'll let you run for a period of time without a product code, which is what we usually do in the labs. The next window is going to ask you which edition you want to install. We've already talked about the various editions, so that's a decision that you've already made at this point. So you should know exactly which edition you're going to install. For right now, as I walk through this section of our lecture, I'm going to show you the installation using the GUI for the full GUI installation. We'll talk about ServerCore in a little bit. So in this example, someone has chosen to install the standard evaluation server with a GUI. So in subsequent windows, you accept the license terms and upgrade or custom installation. So the upgrade option is available only if the supported version of Windows is already installed. So if you already have Windows 2008 installed, you can upgrade from 2008 to 2012. There are some caveats there. For example, 2008 supported 32-bit and or has a 32-bit version, and Server 2012 does not, so that upgrade path is a little bit tricky. But for the most part, you should be able to upgrade. So a custom installation performs a clean install of Windows. So you can either do a clean install or you can do an upgrade of an existing Windows. So you're going to choose from a list of disks from which you want to install Windows. It's going to look a little bit like this. So if you just have one disk, you'll click on the one disk. It may not recognize the disk. I mentioned earlier that you might have some drive architecture, hard drive, some subsystem for storage that is not recognized. So you would have to load the driver for that. So you would have to click on the load driver button, and that could be from a floppy, though. That's not common anymore. But you want to make sure you have the files for that driver handy if you're using a non-standard disk or a non-standard controller. So if you do have to install the driver, you're going to click that new link, and you're prompted to create a new volume from the selected disk. And if you select the disk and click Next, the Windows will create two volumes. One is going to be very small for the system boot files. You won't see a drive letter for that, and then you'll see your C drive. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the C drive, but it's generally recommended with Windows that your system drive be the C drive. It's just normally expected. It doesn't have to be, though. All right, so once Windows begins the installation, your computer will typically restart twice during the installation. And once it's finished, you're going to be prompted to set the administrator password. So that password is going to have to be a minimum of 3 characters that include 3 of the following. So it's going to have uppercase, lowercase, numerals, special symbols, and so forth. So you're going to have at least 3 of those and at least 3 characters. It's a pretty small password, but I think most people can come up with a password like that. Again, in many organizations, that default administrator password for the local machine will be predetermined for you. So you'll put in whatever the standard password is for the server. When you're prompted, you're going to log into to open the server manager, and that's going to allow you to complete all of the rest of the configuration tasks. So at this point, you would be able to complete the configuration of your server using the server manager. But what if you installed the wrong edition? There is a command you can use to modify the edition. So you could switch to a different edition of Windows Server if you need to. So you can also use the DISM command to upgrade an evaluation edition of Windows Server to the standard or data center licensed editions. So once you have a product key, you can use that command to convert to a full version of the software, to the operating system. So to see what editions you are eligible to upgrade to, you're going to use the DISM command that you see here, and that will tell you. And so get target editions is going to show you the editions that you're able to install. So one of the problems with installation is you may get an error saying that the disk isn't found when you're trying to do your installation. That means that it cannot find the driver. So you're going to have to click the load driver link that I showed you earlier. You'll be prompted to insert a medium containing the disk controller driver. So you're going to usually going to go to the disk controller's website if you don't have the driver, and then you're going to either use a USB drive, or if you have one, a floppy drive, though it's not common. But after the driver is loaded, the disk should be displayed, and then you can continue the installation. So definitely something to be aware of, that don't panic if you get that screen. It obviously won't happen in our lab environment, but in the real world this happens rather frequently. After the installation is done, you're going to activate your Windows server. So activation should automatically happen, but if it doesn't, it has to be done within 10 days after the installation. I would caution you to make sure that this is done. If you forget to activate Windows, it will do some strange things. So it'll start to reboot itself. It'll turn itself off. It'll warn you that it's not activated, and then you can have some downtime and availability issues if you don't. And I've seen this happen in data centers, so it's important to remember this step. It's too easy to forget that. So you want to make sure you set the correct date and time zone if you hadn't done so already. And if you need to assign a static IP address, you'll do this in the post-installation. Although you could also use DHCP, as I explained earlier, which is the more common method using reservations. You'll also have to assign a computer name, which again has to be unique. Configure automatic updates if you're going to be turning that on. That's usually an institutional decision, by the way, as to whether or not you're going to be using automatic updates. And then you'll download and install any available updates as well. And again, that'll be an institution decision as to which of those updates you're going to install once you complete the installation. So you may have to install patches and updates. So updates, really, Microsoft has a couple different labels for these updates to software. A patch fixes bugs and security vulnerabilities and can be installed through Windows Updates. Windows Update downloads and installs new drivers and service packs periodically. And a service pack is a collection of bug fixes. So you can think of a service pack as a collection of patches, which can be applied to the server. And again, all of this can happen through automatic updates. And you'll see this through the Server Manager. So that's where you'll configure your automatic updates. All right, so viewing and installing your updates. To get a list of all of the updates, you'll use the Local Server Properties window, click the Windows Update link, and then click View Update History. After the computer is configured and up to date, you can start installing server roles and additional features, and it's going to look something like this. So this is where you install your additional, you install your updates for your server. And we'll talk a little bit more about updates in a little bit when we talk about features on demand towards the end of this section. At some point, you may need to expand your network. So when you're adding a new server, you have to decide whether the server will be one of the following. So there are four different things, four different basic ways you can set up your server. The first is as a domain controller in an existing domain. So if you already have a domain, you may be adding a new domain controller to an existing domain, and this will now become yet another domain controller. And this will typically be done to add some fault tolerance or to give a local presence for a domain controller. You could have a read-only domain controller in the existing domain. So you already have a domain, but you're adding another server that's read-only. This might be done at a remote office or something along those lines. So it does not make updates, but it can read from the domain. It might be a member server in the existing domain. So it's not a domain controller. It's just a server, but it happens to be part of the domain. And I would say this is the vast majority of servers in a large enterprise will typically be member servers in the existing domain, just like a workstation is a member of the domain. And then finally, it could be a standalone server that's not part of a domain at all, and it is also not a domain controller. There's one that's missing on this list. You may be creating a new domain. This might be the first domain controller on your network, and really that falls under the first category of a domain controller in an existing domain, because by the time you're installing that server, you've made some decisions about the domain. We're going to talk more about domain controllers later on in this course. Some reasons to add servers to your network might include growth of the company. So as the company grows, you'll need to add additional servers to handle the additional load. Excessive load in existing servers, so you might outgrow servers before you realize it. So to fix that, you'll add additional servers for high availability. You might need to isolate an application. It might need its own server for some reason. There are a variety of reasons that may happen, but that's a common reason for adding servers to a network. And there might be a need for fault tolerance. So loss of access to server resources is a reduction in productivity and increase in costs. So in many cases, we're going to use multiple servers to achieve fault tolerance. And addition of a branch office. So you might be adding additional offices over time, and they're going to need additional servers at their locations. In many cases, it's not efficient to have servers that are, or to have branch offices that do, or that have to access the servers on the remote network. So if you have enough users at a remote office, it'll make more sense to have a local presence there with servers, especially with domain controllers and things of that nature. If you are upgrading to Windows Server 2012, there's two main options or methods of doing the upgrade. You can do an in-place upgrade where you boot to the existing OS and then you run the setup from the installation medium, so which means that you're already in the existing Windows version, and you're going to run the installation or begin the installation while you're already logged in. The other one is a server role migration where you perform a clean install of Windows Server 2012 and migrate the server roles to the old operating system version being performed. So you've got two options there for your upgrading. So an in-place upgrade, only Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2 can be upgraded to 2012. So if you're running 2003, you will not be able to directly upgrade from 2003 to 2006 or 2012, and likewise from 2000 or from NT. Theoretically, what you could do if you were, say, running Windows NT is you could upgrade NT to 2000, then upgrade 2000 to 2003, then upgrade 2003 to 2008, and so forth till you land on 2012. Theoretically, that should work, but it's an awful long process. So it may be just easier just to install from scratch. If you're running ServerCore, you can only upgrade to Windows Server 2012 ServerCore, which means you cannot go from ServerCore 2008 to a GUI version of 2012. But what you can do is after you upgrade from ServerCore 2008 to ServerCore 2012, you could add the GUI afterwards. So there is an upgrade path in 2012 to go to the GUI if you need to. All Windows Server 2012 R2 versions are 64-bit. So if you're running 2008 32-bit version, it's going to require a clean install. You won't be able to do that directly. You can upgrade to a different language. So if you have a system installed that's in one language and you want to go to English, for example, you won't be able to do that. You have to keep it in the same language. So these are the upgrade paths based on editions. As you probably know, 2008 had different editions than 2012. They changed and simplified the different editions for Windows Server. So in the newer versions, you have different editions. So this just shows you the mapping between the two, and this is from your textbook. Obviously, you can see this information with Microsoft as well when you're planning your upgrade. So Microsoft recommends a clean installation followed by server role migration. So migration allows you to do the following. You can migrate from a 32-bit version of Windows to Server 2012, which is obviously 64-bit. You can migrate from Server 2003 and later, and you can migrate a Windows Server 2008 R2 ServerCore installation to a GUI installation after you do the clean installation. In the next section, we're going to talk about ServerCore. So in our next video, I will talk about ServerCore and some of the initial configuration that you'll have to do with ServerCore. And then in our third video, we'll talk about features on demand.